So we will be taking you to the US-Israel war that's currently happening in Iran and how it has sparked economic alarms for South Africa. We chat to Dawie Roodt, who unpacks the details of how this affects South Africa and the globe. Dawie is from the Efficient Group and he's a chief economist. Very good morning and assalamu alaikum to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you.
Take us through what is currently happening and how this affects South Africa, but how it also affects the economics of the world.
Yeah, I think a good place to start will be about 2 weeks ago, just before the outbreak of hostilities in the Middle East. And maybe just this, the South African economy has been really performing quite badly for many, many years, for decades, in fact. And the average South African today is poorer than 20 years ago. And there are many reasons for that. But what has happened the past year or so, there were some signs of improvement in the South African economy. Like, for example, inflation has been lower. The Reserve Bank started cutting interest rates. The Minister of Finance's budget 2 weeks ago sounded much more realistic. And there were signs that the debt levels of the state will start leveling off. Some signs of slightly better economic growth. Not predictions of very good economic growth. It seemed as if the South African economy was turning around a little bit. And then what happened is that the war broke out in the Middle East. Oil price went up. And all of a sudden, all the good green shoots that we witnessed some 2 weeks or so ago seem to be withering away. And it really depends on how long this conflict is going to go on. Or put differently, it really depends on how long the international oil price is going to remain elevated. And not only that, it also depends on how long the South African currency, the rand, is likely to remain under pressure. Because with a high international oil price and a weaker currency, inevitably what is going to happen is that the oil price or the petrol price will go up. It will put upward pressure on inflation. That means that the Reserve Bank certainly is not going to cut interest rates now. I expected the Reserve Bank to cut interest rates soon, but they can't do it now. And in fact, if the oil price remains high, the Reserve Bank may decide to increase interest rates. That means weaker economic growth. It also means that the fiscal accounts of the Minister of Finance will be under pressure. And that means that where we expected a further upgrade in South Africa's debt, that is unlikely to happen. And in the end, it means weaker economic growth, and it means another slowdown in per capita revenue. So clearly, what is happening in the Middle East is impacting quite heavily on the South African economy. But the extent thereof will really depend on how long this is going to go on, where the oil price is going to settle, and what's going to happen to the exchange rate of the currency. And that is pretty much the picture for many other countries in the world as well. South Africa only differs in the sense that the South African economy has been really underperforming for many, many years now. And because of wrong macroeconomic policies and so on, while the rest of the world mostly experienced some strong economic growth for many, many years, while South Africa is a bit of an underperformer. And now it seems as if we have to wait at least another couple of months or maybe a year or two before we can get back to a trajectory of stronger economic growth.
That's a very scary picture that you just painted, but a reality of the current situation and the cost of war. How is it that a country like South Africa can insulate itself from this in the future, if possible at all?
Well, the short answer is probably not much that we can do. There are a couple of things that we can do, but it takes time. We pretty much closed down most of our refineries in South Africa. We can start Sasol 2, for example, if you want to get fuel from coal, because we have a lot of coal reserves, but then the greenies are going to be on your back. So those are the kind of things that we can do to make us less dependent on international energy. On the exchange rate of that will take a long time, and the short answer is probably there's not much that we can do because we are dependent on international oil. But the exchange rate of the currency, as far as the exchange rate of the currency is concerned, there are things that we can do about that. Remember, the exchange rate of the currency, the rand, can be protected by increasing interest rates. And like I've said earlier, if inflationary pressures build up, then the Reserve Bank will have to increase interest rates in order to make sure that inflation doesn't get out of hand. And that is likely to support the exchange rate of the currency. But the price that we're going to pay will be much weaker economic growth. So I'm afraid there's no shortcut here. There's no easy way of getting away from this. I guess what one can and should do, perhaps, is under more normal circumstances, put measures in place to grow the economy as fast as you possibly can, put some money aside, and that goes for individuals as well. Put some money aside and see if you can cushion the blow as much as you possibly can. But the problem, and like what I've said, is that South Africa's economy hardly grew for something like 20 years. There simply isn't reserves available at the moment, and now we're really paying a price for this lack of economic growth and the wrong macroeconomic policies that we followed for such a long period of time. So we are pretty much down, and now when we're down, this new crisis hits South Africa, and it's going to be very painful to us. But I must say, this morning, looking at the prices, yesterday the oil price went up to $118. And if it remained at $118, then I'm afraid we were in for some serious pain in South Africa. But this morning, the oil price is down to about $92 when I last looked. So it is still not good, but it's certainly much better than, say, $118. So with a bit of luck, we can see an end to hostilities in the Middle East and the oil price gradually drifting lower again. But I can just say that even if they stop the war completely now, and even if the oil price falls back to $70, there is a shock in the system, and we're still going to pay a price. Of course, not as much if the oil price was above $100, but the shock is there. And the Reserve Bank is not going to cut yet. I expected them to cut, but they're certainly not going to cut. But the shock is there, and it will take some time for the economies to work through this new impact on the economy.
No, thank you for that. And I just want to ask you to just stay tuned with us. We just need to go into an ad break, but that is Dawie Roodt, who's unpacking for us the economic impact on South Africa that the US-Israel war with Iran currently has. We'll be right back.
For the first time, I can dream again.
The Africa Muslims Agency Orphan Hope Program provides the food, clothing, and basic support needed by thousands of children across the world. Every child deserves a chance at a hopeful future.
For 50,000 rands, you can transform our lives with the AMA Orphan Hope Program.
Africa Muslims Agency, empowering, educating, inspiring.
You know, it's a wonder how kids get anything done these days. With all the distractions, when do they even get time to study? As a mother, all I can really do is make sure they have all they need to perform at their best. That's why I choose to include Sunfoil, triple refined pure sunflower oil with every meal I make. Naturally cholesterol-free and approved by the Heart and Stroke Foundation as part of a balanced eating plan. So whether I'm cooking, frying or baking, I know every dish will be a wholesome one. Sunfoil, now we're cooking.
Discover the Africa of your dreams and surround yourself with her spectacular beauty. Relax beneath her serene sunsets and explore wildlife at its natural best. It's where the pride of Africa comes together. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve. Get to know the Big Five or cruise on an elephant safari game drive. Interact with lion and tiger cubs and enjoy world-class halal cuisine while we pamper you during your 5-star stay. Indulge in the true African experience. For reservations, call now on 042-203-1400 or visit kwantu.co.za. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve, the place of gathering.
Freedom Stationery supply Marlin and Marlin Kids pens to me and my school friends. They supply just about everything we need to help us get a better education, from books to files to rulers. In fact, any any accessory we need. Freedom Stationery. Education for the nation. What does accessory mean?
With Ashraful Aid this Ramadan, your zakat changes lives. It feeds families facing hunger, restores dignity to those in need, and brings hope where it is needed most. From food relief to essential support, your zakah reaches communities with care, transparency, and impact. Give with confidence, give with trust. Make your zakah count this Ramadan. Give your zakah to Ashraful Aid and help change lives today.
You are listening to Salam Media live from our headquarters in South Africa. This is Salam Media, keeping you company this Ramadan.
If you've just joined us, we are here speaking to Dawie, who is the Efficient Group Chief Economist, who's speaking to us about the economic alarm and impact that South Africa will have with regards to the current war that is happening in Iran. Before we went to an ad break, Dawie, you were speaking about how this conflict will disrupt the shipping and supply. Are you able to tell us which sectors perhaps in South Africa will be largely impacted by this instability?
Yeah, maybe one should just add something else as well. I spoke about the increase in energy prices, and that's quite clear, and it's easy to understand how that will impact on the economy. For example, we use a lot of diesel in South Africa. The agricultural industry uses a lot of diesel. Not only that, Eskom quite often uses a lot of diesel, and that will put also upward pressure on things like, for example, electricity prices. And if the diesel price goes up, it will put upward pressure on agricultural things like food prices and so on. But there's another factor that we quite often forget about, and that is when you talk about oil, it is not only diesel or petrol that is affected, but other things that are related to oil, like, for example, fertilizer. Fertilizer prices already has gone up, and fertilizer significant impact, especially on the agricultural industry, and that means upward pressure on food prices. Now, again, I must tell you that we must wait and see what's going to happen. It's early time still. Maybe things will change. Maybe the oil price will come down. Maybe there will be peace. Who knows? But so I'm speculating here. But what is clear is that the oil price has gone up, or the diesel price will go up. Maybe it will come down in a couple of months, but it will go up. Fertilizer prices will go up, and it will have an impact on things like, for example, food prices and so on. So that's one industry, and that's agriculture. Of course, many other industries will be affected as well. The mining industry is also very dependent on these kinds of inputs, generally speaking, and the economy, the transport industry will be affected as well. So it's pretty much everybody. And I think since in a modern economy, it is a bit artificial to try to make a distinction between the various industries, because everything is interrelated. And what affects one part of the economy will have an impact on the rest of the economy as well. But certainly some industries will be harder hit, at least initially.
That sounds like it's in fact most, if not the entire supply chain, because we can imagine if something starts from agriculture, transport then follows, and it's just that whole domino and ripple effect. You spoke about the economic fall. How would this look like in an ideal world? You did say that South Africa's economic growth has been quite stagnant over the past for a good 20 years now. But in an ideal situation, how would the cushioning that you made reference to actually look like to absorb the shock, just using your words?
Yeah. It really depends on what's going to happen, where the price is going to stabilize. But what I think there are basically two instruments that are available, or more, of course, but two major instruments available to the authorities. The one is monetary policy. That is what the Reserve Bank is responsible for. And I can tell you, we should all be very, very grateful that we have the South African Reserve Bank, and that we have a Reserve Bank that followed certain policies, monetary policy, the last couple of years, in fact. Because if it hasn't been for the South African Reserve Bank, inflation would have been a significant problem in South Africa. And inflation is a real killer to economic growth. So that part of the policy mix, at least, has been managed quite well. And like I've mentioned earlier, the Reserve Bank, if necessary, may decide to actually increase interest rates as well. And maybe on this point, I just want to make a very important point, that we have inflation targets of 3% in South Africa. And on an individual basis, you and I and everybody listening to us now, if anybody wants to increase their price above 3%, you must really try to push back. Do not accept price increases anything above 3%. So that's the one policy instrument that is being very wisely used in South Africa. The other one has to do with fiscal policy. The fiscal policy is what the Minister of Finance is responsible for, and that has been a bit of a mess for many, many years now. The state debt levels have gotten out of hand, and that means that the Minister of Finance is simply not in a position to do much to cushion the South African economy. He can do things like, for example, reduce taxes on petrol, but that will mean then that we have to increase taxes on other things. You can try to spend more money on, say, support on the grants, for example, but that means that you will need to increase taxes or borrow. So in the case of the fiscal accounts, there simply isn't not much that the Minister of Finance can do. But of course, there are many other things that can be done. Like, for example, we can change certain macroeconomic policies that have been obstacles to economic growth for a long time in any event. Things like, for example, the way that local authorities are managed. The local authorities in South Africa are a disaster. Things like, for example, expropriation legislation. Those kind of things can be changed to support the economy over the longer term. But in the short term, I'm afraid to say there's not really much that we can do to cushion the South African economy.
So Reuters reports that G7 finance ministers are discussing the release of emergency oil stocks. That the final decision could be taken by the 7 countries' leader later this week. Do you think that these emergency oil stocks will trickle down to countries such as South Africa or Africa, or do you think that these G7 countries will first get the good share of it?
No, we must remember that when you talk about oil, for example, or many of these commodities that are traded internationally, the price that is paid internationally, that's the price that everybody more or less pays. In the case of the Americans, for example, they are completely self-reliant on their own energy production, so they don't need energy from the Middle East, but it doesn't mean that they are not affected. In fact, petrol prices in the United States already started going up. So the question is about these strategic reserves, and many countries in the world, including South Africa, are holding strategic reserves, and they've decided to start selling some of these in order to prevent the oil price from rising much further. But we have to remember that these are, exactly as the word says, strategic reserves, and are not supposed to be used to cushion price changes. They are supposed to be used under emergency conditions. So yes, it will make a bit of a difference, and I think it already made a bit of a difference, but eventually they will run out of that as well. And in the end, what really matters is that we need more stability in the Middle East to make sure that the oil keeps on flowing from the Middle East before the price will really stabilize somewhere and perhaps go down a little bit. I can perhaps just make this comment that depending how you look at it, but the correct level of the oil price should be around about $70 or maybe $65, somewhere there. Currently, it is just above $90. So clearly, the oil price is much, much higher than that, what economists call the equilibrium level. And if we should see peace in the Middle East, hopefully within a couple of months, we could see the oil price back to say $70 or so again. But releasing oil from the strategic reserves will help a little bit, but that's not a real long-term answer.
Yeah. So you've spoken to us about, the impact that this has on South Africa, the economic growth and all of those things. I just want to check with you on a more global one, if this conflict escalates into a broader regional war that also involves the United States and Iran, how real is the risk of a global economic slowdown or a recession? And what would this mean for South Africa as well? As you've mentioned, the exports are already weak and the growth, but could we be looking at an economic recession globally should this be prolonged? And how much of time do we have before it actually gets to that?
Well, there is a significant risk to this. And let me sketch a possible scenario. And some analysts are actually talking about the possibility of the oil price going to $150, and that's not impossible. Say, for example, more countries get involved in this conflict in the Middle East, and it spills over into even more involved in this, and it's done completely, and eventually they start running out of strategic reserves to provide to the market. And it's certainly possible for the oil price to go to $150 and say that it stays at $150 for say only 6 months. then we are definitely talking about a global recession. Then we're talking about global economic growth that will collapse, basically. Significant contraction in economic growth globally, inflationary pressures globally, interest rates going up internationally, equity markets, financial markets correcting quite strongly. Last week, for example, the equities markets fell by 10% only in 1 week, but it can be significantly worse if the oil price goes up to $150 and stays there. And this is the important part of this. Even $100 and it stays there, it's going to be bad for economic growth. It's not necessarily the level that's that important, it's how long it's going to stay at an elevated level. That is actually more important. But you're absolutely right. If the oil price remains elevated even at $120 or even $110, and it stays there for 6 months or a year, it will have a significant impact on global economic growth.
Oh, I'm just listening to all of this. Growing up, we read or we hear about the Great Depression and probably lived through some recession of some sort, or just read about it. And, what you're explaining just seems like it might be, the reality that we live up to. But just in parting, what would you say, or how would you say that what lessons do we take from this? I mean, obviously and clearly, aside from the human cost that wars and conflict has, there is this economic cost that comes with it. And unfortunately, also another ripple effect, because with economic costs also comes additional human cost, because if the economy is so bad, people might end up starving, which then leads to more deaths as well, deaths of people who aren't involved in this conflict, so they are indirectly affected as well. What are your parting words and perhaps advice on how we better deal with where we find ourselves?
Yeah, something that you and we haven't spoken about yet, and that's politics this morning. And I have to be very careful what I say about politics.
I
But a few
didn't
things.
want to rope you into the broader politics of things, but please do feel free.
Yes, okay. I think there are a couple of things that we must be very careful about. We must understand as a country that we are a small, open economy, which means whatever happens internationally, and this is a good example, will we have to do that very, very carefully so that when something like this happens, it's not going to affect the South African economy. So I think our politicians must take note of what has happened here and make sure that we position ourselves. And I understand the morality issues of all of this, but it's important to put South Africa first and to make sure that we very, very carefully position ourselves internationally. You don't have to take sides necessarily, but you must understand that we will pay a price. And what I'm very concerned about, and that is that the ANC and Donald Trump, the President Donald Trump, is not sitting around the same table, and that can eventually mean some more pain for South Africa, whether you like him or not. That is just a reality that we have to be aware of. Another point that I want to make, and that is that South Africa is also a member of the BRICS countries. And the BRICS countries is supposed to be this economic bloc, which they are, but they're also supposed to be this political bloc. And the BRICS countries have been very, very quiet of late. Of course, they made some statements, the various BRICS countries, calling for restraint and calling for peace and that. But clearly, the BRICS grouping of countries is certainly a toothless watchdog here. And one would have expected more from the BRICS countries. Very little do come from the BRICS countries. And also keep in mind that it's got some other implications as well. Like there was talks about the BRICS countries creating their own currency as a possible reserve currency. And clearly that the BRICS countries are not, or at least the grouping is not mature enough yet to be a significant political force or even economic force globally as well. So for me as an economist, that is just something interesting I wanted to share.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I wish that we had you for a bit longer, because I would have liked to actually get into the nitty gritties, especially when you rope in issues such as the BRICS. But thank you so much for your time this morning. I think we have all learned a lot from the advice that you have given us, your perspective on things, and we do really appreciate that. That was Dawie Roodt, who is the Efficient Group Chief Economist. Do stay tuned. We will be right back after this.